Hey folks, how's it going? Dr. Spin, Eclectic Album Reviews and General Musical Meanderings. Last year, I did a 5-part series on The Police. That was a pretty gratifying experience overall. I've been thinking more and more about doing another series on a band that was really particularly meaningful for me and maybe shedding some light on a series of albums. And so to that end, I decided to do a series on Marillion. And if you know anything about me, Marillion was really, really important to me at a certain point in time in my life. And I followed their career ever since. I've decided to go ahead and do a 4-part series on the era of Fish in Marillion's catalog. Marillion was founded by drummer Mick Pointer. And Mick Pointer was actually in this band called The Electric Gypsy that he broke off with some other people in the band and formed this group called the Silmarillion, named after the J.R.R. Tolkien novel. There came some concerns after a while, though, that they might run into some legal problems with the use of that name. So eventually, after some lineup changes and some shifting around, they shortened the name to Marillion, and they eventually settled into a lineup of Mick Pointer on drums, Steve Rothery on guitar, Pete Roabus on bass, Mark Kelly on keyboards, and Fish on lead vocalist. And this lineup eventually produced the album Script for a Jester's Tear. This is their debut album, released in 1983. Because this whole series is predicated on Fish and his involvement with the group, I think that Script for a Jester's Tear is a pretty good place to start, because he's extremely present on this album. His influence on the album is extremely profound. What made him such a great lead man for Marillion going forward was almost immediately a present from this very first debut album. Now, Fish is a really interesting and kind of unlikely lead man. He's a tall guy, kind of sometimes a little bit on the overweight side, not particularly attractive, and really in many ways not even all that great of a singer. But he's ridiculously charismatic, extremely impassioned in his performances, and almost mesmerizing. It's difficult not to watch him.
Here I am once more in the playground of the broken hearts. One more experience, one more entry in a diary self-pen. Yet another emotional suicide, overdosed on sentiment and pride. Too late to say I love you, too late to restage the play, abandoning the relics in my playground of yesterday.
Certainly his conception of performance is very strongly influenced by Peter Gabriel. I think it's pretty fair to say that his interpretation of Peter Gabriel's stage presence could be viewed as bothersome by some people. The melodrama is pretty high. But where Peter Gabriel was pretty surreal in his approach to being a lead man for Genesis, Fish is a little bit more sinister and takes a little bit more of a dark approach than the average stereotypical idea of progressive rock. You know, up to this point, you're talking about the most visible names in progressive rock were bands like Yes and Genesis, and all those guys, although those guys did have kind of dark aspects of what they were doing, is nothing near what Marillion was doing coming out of the gate here. They talked a lot about topics such as like unrequited love and suicide and drug use and the horrors of war, topics that kind of you couldn't see the average high profile progressive rock band from the 70s really doing. In general, Fish's lyrics wove a pretty grim tapestry over Script for a Jester's Tear, and that was one of the things that kind of made it distinctive. Even in the more fanciful mode, the video that they made for Garden Party, which is one of their hits that was made a little bit of traction in the UK, starts off as just them sort of enacting the folly of sort of mischievous children, and then by the end of the video, they're sort of like calling on the dark arts.
Another blue, mother smile, she did it too. Check this false charm, locking onto royal arms.
Now, I wasn't a particularly dark or broody teenager growing up, but I had a sensitive side, and I felt kind of like a big, awkward kid growing up. So I had felt like a connection with Fish as a singer and the topics that he sang about, even though I wasn't that particularly moody. He was one of the few lyricists I think that could almost hold a candle to Neil Peart's work to me at that point in time. I mean, I liked the lyrics of many other artists, but Fish really got to me on some of those, just his poetic nature of his lyrics. But as strong as Fish's lyrics were on this very first debut album, there's definitely some criticisms I think that you can level musically at Script for a Jester's Tear, that you can't look at other albums from Marillion the same way. It in some ways lacks a lot of the musical nuance of Marillion's later work. Steve Rothery's playing great. He sort of came out of the head of Zeus fully formed in some ways. His guitar playing is fantastic on the album. He always has very thoughtful guitar solos, and certainly I think it's an underrated guitarist overall, much less in the progressive rock genre. And Pete Trevabas comes out as a really great bass player. You know, he does functionally what a bass player does. I don't think Mark Kelly quite had found his footing yet as a keyboard player. I think certainly moving forward in the band's catalog, he does much more impressive and much more characteristic keyboard work going on. But the songs feel a little bit clunky and a little bit less refined than they would go later on. And that's kind of in due in no small part to the presence of drummer Mick Pointer. Now, this is kind of a funny thing because Mick Pointer is one of the guys that kind of started the band in the first place. But by the time we got to the end of Script for a Jester's Tear, it seemed pretty apparent that he was sort of the weak link in the chain. He had a real high concept but low technique style. He could play things in weird time signatures, but it wasn't particularly interesting or musical. So by the time Script for a Jester's Tear came out and they had toured on it for a little while, Fish had a very strong sense that Mick Pointer wasn't really growing with the band the way that Fish thought that he should be. And so he rallied the troops and got him fired from the group. So Mick Pointer left the group that he had founded. And he went on to start another band called Arena, which has their own kind of interesting long history and their own kind of spotty catalog. And there's certainly some high points in that catalog that would be worth looking at later on. But Mick Pointer was out. If you look at how the band progressed going on, Mick Pointer really couldn't have kept up with what the band was going to be doing, not with the kind of technique that he had. You can also kind of take a look at Marillion's affinity for taking pages out of the Genesis playbook and level some criticisms to them on that front as well. But you got to think of this in context too. You know, progressive rock got to the point in the late 70s where it was so bloated that it kind of couldn't go any further. And that was sort of what the rise of punk rock was a reaction to that in part. So, you know, between the late 70s when punk rock kind of shattered all that stuff and MTV came into the rise, progressive rock was definitely way, way out of vogue and not mainstream in any way, shape, form, or fashion, which is why bands like Genesis and Yes had to really reinvent themselves in the 80s to keep themselves up and running, to the point where their progressive rock status could justifiably been questioned. So for Marillion to come along in 1983 and develop to the point where they make Script for a Jester's Tear is a pretty bold move. I mean, in some ways, it's as countercultural to mainstream music as punk rock was in the late 70s. It's almost that same kind of reaction to the mainstream. And as such, it seems like a very defiant statement, particularly when you look at Fish's almost confrontational identity that he put out there. You know, clearly the band was like, we're trying to do something that because we think that what's happening in the mainstream is drivel. And they did that pretty effectively on Script for a Jester's Tear. That statement is very, very clear. As such, Script for a Jester's Tear is a very important piece of Marillion's puzzle. And I think a pretty strong statement to come out in the 80s. I mean, by itself, in some ways, kind of allowed them to be the torchbearer for progressive rock during its lowest state. Progressive rock had almost completely died out by the time the early 80s had come around. And they became the torchbearers for that style. And moving forward, certainly continued to hold that mantle within certain circles. Of course, keep in mind that Marillion never really scratched the surface in the US. Although they got a little bit of traction in the UK, they had a couple of hit singles, and I think Script for a Chester's Tear ended up being a top 10 album. In the US, it was a drop in the bucket. It never really went anywhere for us. So this is the beautiful thing about going back and doing these videos, because in 1985 or 86, whenever I was really into Marillion, I really had never seen anything that they had done. There was no videos anywhere. I only ever saw like maybe one or two articles on them in magazines, but their videos were something I'd never seen. I'd never actually seen Fish perform. So it's very interesting to go back and see a lot of these older videos now that they're available online in soft format, and getting a chance to re-experience a lot of this music through the lens of what was actually happening at the time. Next go round, I'm going to delve into Fugazi, Marillion's second album. And I think that's really where Fish and Marillion as a whole kind of hit their stride and started really pushing things forward, doing things that would later on really come to a very fruitful artistic head. And I'll be posting that video in a couple of weeks. So if you want to know when that's happening, make sure you like it and subscribe it and share it out to your friends so they know what's happening. Follow me over on Spotify. I've got a list going on, not just of music that I've been listening to that's new, but maybe a track or two from albums that I've been covering. So I'll have a track from Script for a Jester's Tear over there in case you're curious. But then keep your eyes open, and until then, I'll catch you on the flip side.
White